come to understand the incredible potential for kingdom impact we can have in our investing. And during our time together last session, Andy Crouch helped us understand that money is a tool. It can be used for good, but it can also get the best of us. During our time today, we want to help clear something up about our true purpose here on earth. We only get a short time to come to terms with this important truth. It's not about you. That's the very first sentence in Pastor Rick Warren's book, Purpose-Driven Life. He goes on to explain that the quest for personal fulfillment, satisfaction, and meaning can only be found in understanding and doing what God has placed us on the earth to do. This ultimate purpose is not about ourselves. It's not about bringing fame to our name. It's not about trumpeting our success and our achievements. We are here to glorify the one name above all others. This applies to our family, our neighborhoods, our business.
And this also applies to our investing. But if we were to look at this part of our lives with more intentionality, would we be able to conform more to the heart of God? Like I said before, this isn't meant to be prescriptive. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. How we go about making an impact is varied. It could look different in the private markets versus the public markets. Personally, I believe in the power of business. It can either create harm or create compelling value for the world. That's why I believe Christians should avoid investing in companies that are causing harm and instead seek to invest in the companies that are promoting human flourishing. I also believe that there are wonderful ways for us as shareholders to engage with the companies that we're investing in. The beauty of the faith-driven investing movement is that all Christians have the opportunity to bring their faith, convictions, and biblical understandings into the conversation. You might reconsider your approach to public market or private market investing. Maybe you give more. You might be led to invest more, or it can lead you to become more intentional about the asset class you're in, to find places where there's intentional spiritual integration. Wherever God calls you, it's important to seek His guidance in this area of your life with the same intentionality that we do with where we live and serve. My friend John Coleman has been featured in Fox Business, Forbes, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and The Financial Times. He has published several books with the Harvard Business Review, including Passion and Purpose. He has some great insights to share on this subject. Let's watch.
In a commencement speech to Kenyon College, the writer David Foster Wallace offered a wonderful little vignette. Two little fish are swimming through the ocean when they pass an older fish who tips his hat to him and says, "Good morning, gents. How's the water?" The two little fish continue to swim past when one fish looks at the other and says, "What's water?" The moral of the story, of course, is that sometimes the hardest things to see are those that surround us every day. And that's true, I think, of financial assets in the broader world. If you look at the world of financial investments today, there are more than $120 trillion in managed assets around the world. And those assets touch almost every facet of our life. They finance the big companies that we're all familiar with, companies like Coca-Cola or Home Depot or UPS in my hometown of Atlanta, down to smaller companies that use debt or equity financing for the local yogurt shop or deli on your street, for the iPhone in your pocket, for the clothes that you wear, even for the mortgages that you take out on your home. This world of managed assets is all around us every day, shaping the culture in which we live, and yet we rarely think about it. However, much of the mainstream world, particularly the investing world, has woken up to the idea that this financial capital all around the world shapes our culture in meaningful ways and has spurred a renaissance in what we think of as values-based investing, or what much of the mainstream world calls environmental, social, and governance investing, ESG. This is where companies or institutions or investment management firms really think about the values that they hold dear and try and action those in the investments that they make. Within the ESG framework, environmental concerns often involve things like combating global climate change, putting in place environmentally friendly standards in real estate development opportunities, thinking about the carbon emissions of the companies with which they work. The social framework also thinks about the social impact of that capital on communities, whether that be the diversity of the employee base or whether there are human rights abuses or human trafficking in supply chain. And the governance part of that, the G in ESG, thinks about how those companies are led, whether that's just the separation of the CEO and chairman roles within a boardroom or the diversity of the board itself. There are more than $40 trillion in those assets around the world right now, and most mainstream investment managers and mainstream institutions are using those principles to shape the world in meaningful ways. This looks like a variety of different strategies. On the far end, there's negative screening, something with which we're almost all familiar, which is where you exclude holdings that you feel are misaligned with your values from your portfolio. And yet it's expanded far beyond that to include a variety of positive tools. There's positive screening, where you look for characteristics in a company that you actually care about, that you want to promote. There's thematic investing, which you overinvest in industries or segments that you want to see grow, like renewable energy. There's activist investing, where public companies will find activist shareholders who come in and try and rejuvenate their cultures. And there's broad-based ESG stewardship, where almost every major investment manager in the world seeks to align their voting preferences in public companies with the types of values that ESG promotes. All told, this comprises a comprehensive framework by which major institutions and investors seek to engage with the world. And that engagement is in a very concentrated set of hands. If you look at the top 10 asset managers around the world, those 10 asset managers now control more than 30% of the S&P 500 and a similar percentage of investments broadly in the world. There are 10 asset management companies who control almost a third of the investments in the world. The top 3 of those asset managers, State Street, Vanguard, and BlackRock, control almost 20% of the S&P 500 and comprise collectively the largest shareholder in 88% of the S&P 500. And almost all of those firms have some concentrated group thinking about the values they're expressing in their investments. At BlackRock, for example, there's a team of more than 50 ESG specialists who think about aligning their investment dollars across trillions of dollars of different investments with the values that they and their clients hold dear. And it's not just the largest asset managers who are doing it. If you look in the smaller asset management world, there are a variety of niche investors who are seeking to change the world through the values of their investments. One of the greatest examples from last year was a small firm less than $500 million called Engine No. 1 that, with a 0.02% stake in ExxonMobil, managed to effectively take over the board agenda of one of the largest public companies in the world. By rallying larger investors like public pension plans and some of the asset managers that we mentioned, Engine No. 1, with this tiny less than 1% stake, was able to gain 3 board seats at Exxon on an agenda trying to seek to more closely embed climate change principles in the governance of that company. And there are countless examples where smaller asset managers have made a big difference on the companies in which they operate. Unfortunately, even as this idea has grown in the mainstream, it's lagged amongst Christians. Christianity and Judaism and Islam have this remarkable history of impact or values-based investing over the last 5,000 years. In the ancient Jewish scriptures, there were tons of admonitions about how to align your financial activity with the principles of your faith. Similarly, in Islam, Sharia finance has risen up throughout the course of the history of that religion to dominate the way in which Muslims think about stewarding their financial assets. Christianity talks about in the New Testament scriptures the way in which we should seek to steward assets. And a few hundred years ago, the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, laid out some of the first negative screening principles, excluding things like alcohol, tobacco, and firearms from investment portfolios, a series of criteria that stayed largely consistent for Christians to this day. It was even the Episcopal Church in 1971 who really ignited the modern activist or ESG movement when, holding less than 1% of General Motors stock, they launched a campaign to change that company's activities in apartheid South Africa that really catalyzed a movement on apartheid generally and in corporate engagement generally that gave birth to this modern ESG movement. And yet, if you look over the last 50 years, Christians and faith-driven investing have either stagnated or declined, even as mainstream values investing has risen. Today in the United States, there are more than $50 trillion in public equities, and yet there are only about $28 billion of explicitly faith-driven investment strategies in U.S. public markets, most of which is just negative screening. Comprehensively, there are somewhere between $100 and $250 billion in faith-driven investing globally, despite the fact that Christians must control somewhere on the order of $20 to $40 trillion in financial impact. Effectively, as the rest of the world has woken up to this idea that their values can be expressed in their investments to change culture, Christians have often relegated that responsibility to their mainstream counterparts, rather than developing a distinctively faith-driven approach to those topics. That doesn't have to be the case. There are options for Christians, just like the mainstream ESG world, to express their values as part of their investment strategy. That can look like negative screening, certainly, but it can go beyond negative screening to positively screening the types of characteristics we want to see in companies, those that we think encourage love of neighbor and human flourishing amongst employees, customers, and suppliers. It can move into things like activism and ESG engagement, where we vote proxy shares, where we try and influence the agendas of public corporations and private companies through voting our shares and through issuing letters to those boards, something that many ETF companies are now taking on. It can look like concessionary impact, where we explicitly place mission above financial returns in our priorities and seek to fund initiatives that might otherwise not be funded. And it can look like detailed company and cultural formation, something near and dear to my heart, where through venture capital or private equity or private credit or real estate, we can actually shape from their origination these assets around the world to cultures that align with the principles of our Christian faith. You can seed or invest in early stage companies so that entrepreneurs who are Christians can seek to shape those companies with the principles of their faith. You can invest in private companies and come alongside those owner-operators to try and build cultures that are aligned with Christian faith. We've seen this amongst a number of companies in the United States and around the world, and they create better cultures for employees, but also create cultures that are their competitive advantage and outperform from a financial perspective others in the marketplace. This is a huge opportunity for Christians, not just to think about the impact of their charitable giving, which sometimes comprises only 5 or 10% of what people have, but to think about the other 90 or 95% of their assets that are going to investments. And instead of yielding the influence of those investments to mainstream managers, to wield them for influence aligned with their Christian faith. Fortunately, there are more options than ever in faith-driven investing, comprising ETF and mutual fund companies, fixed income strategies, public equity strategies, private equity and venture strategies, credit, real estate, and almost every asset class you can imagine. And if you dig into it, there are faith-aligned managers out there who can help you steward your capital well. But the key for us is to simply get off the sidelines, to realize that all of the assets that we have impact. All investing is impact investing. And the only question for us is whether we're going to steward that impact well, aligned with the principles of our Christian faith, to create a better world that encourages love of neighbor and human flourishing, or whether we're going to yield that impact to others, delegate our responsibility to others who may or may not align with those values. The question is put to us today, and I would encourage everyone to get off the sidelines and really think about using all of their financial capital, all this water that surrounds us every day, for a positive impact aligned with their faith.
What does it look like to be more intentional about our investing? Like John talked about, it starts first with awareness. Understanding what is happening in your investments. Oftentimes, we unwittingly invest and take ownership in ventures and funds that are contrary to our values. You'll hear stories across the faith-driven movement of families who are beginning to understand what they're invested in and charting a different course. It's not just families, but also fund managers like Eventide, Sovereign's Capital, and so many others that are leading the way towards financial return while making an impact. Let's watch the story of Eventide and catch a glimpse of the change happening from their offices in Boston.
The more that I have been alive on this planet, the more I have seen how incredibly influential capital is to shape the world in so many different ways. That really what capital is fundamentally the ability to direct creativity and resources in one direction or another. One of the dreams that we had in starting Eventide is this concept of enlarging the common good and thinking about how the enlargement of the common good can also be a platform for the redemptive good. We're trying to show the world what it can look like if people actually love one another and do that in a systematic, comprehensive, business-centered way. That gives us the ability to now be, at least in some way, the city on a hill that Jesus wants us to be.
Proverbs chapter 11, it says, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. But when the wicked prosper, the people groan. Proverbs also says, when the righteous prosper, the city rejoices. And when the wicked are defeated, there are shouts of joy. The righteous are people that prosper by taking care of their cities, by uplifting the poor. And as they prosper, they continue to uplift the poor. Whereas the wicked are people that often prosper through exploitation. As the wicked are prospering, the people are groaning because the wicked are people that are hurting the poor in the city. So we want to partner with companies that are uplifting their communities and the whole of society.
So in February 2021, in our normal course of business, we were analyzing companies in the solar and clean energy space, and we started to see headlines linking forced labor in China to some solar companies. And that really caused immediate alarm, and we did about 3 months of research, intensive research, across the spectrum from the solar supply chain to the greater context of oppression of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang in China. And we began to really engage the industry, starting with companies, starting with CEOs and leaders. The industry really wasn't aware of this. And further, they certainly didn't have a solution. And so what we wanted to do was lend our voice as investors to this critical resource, solar energy, this critical technology, and educate the market on, one, here's how forced labor is wrapped into the supply chain. Two, here's the broader context of oppression. We wanted to appeal to people so that they would really understand that this isn't sort of a traditional forced labor situation. It's instituted by the government that is massive in scale. And then three, provide a solution. So we've developed a market-based solution that transitions the supply chain away from forced labor, starting with companies that you would buy from if you wanted to buy a solar panel, and then gradually working all the way down to the raw materials.
The thesis of Eventide is that investing is ownership, and that ownership confers ethical responsibility to the owner for the actions of the company. And so we therefore want to avoid things that are harming individuals. We want to avoid activities that are taking advantage of people. And then we want to celebrate and pursue wholeheartedly companies that are blessing the world, that are adding value to the world, that are promoting the global common good.
So we were praying about what we should do in terms of how do we help Christians invest money. And there were just principles that we saw in the Bible. And one of the principles that we saw was avoiding ill-gotten gain. Proverbs 1 has a whole passage about avoiding ill-gotten gain and not sharing a purse with people that plunder. So early on, we created a kind of an avoidance list. So we said, okay, these are definitely problem areas. Christians would not or should not profit and partner with businesses that do these types of things.
Investing is ownership, company ownership. It's a very helpful metaphor for thinking about what's happening when you invest. You're owning specific businesses. These businesses are not buildings, they're a network of relationships that impact our neighbors. Capital should be a servant in the world, that it should be something that creates and enlarges flourishing. Back in the early 1600s, we got the introduction of the stock and the bond as a financing mechanism for business. But what happened is that the early stocks and bonds were tremendously successful, very, very successful, and many people made fortunes. And word about the fortunes of those early investments spread very rapidly. And what happened is, gradually, people began to pay less and less attention to what these stocks and bonds, what company was behind them. And so there was basically the Christian community began to be disturbed by this phenomenon that capital would be going toward things without a lot of intentionality and thought behind it. And this culminated in John Wesley, who was an English minister in the 1700s, preaching a sermon to his congregation called The Use of Money, where he dealt very directly with how we should be thinking about investing our money. And so that was really, in many ways, the beginning of the responsible investing movement that we know today. In fact, secular historians say that sermon was the starting place of the entire movement. It began as a Christian movement. And it was really driven by this desire to not separate the returns of investing from the impact of investing, but to consider them both with one mind. I think one of the things that stands out in the Eventide culture is that the reason we are gathered together and working together is to pursue a sense of calling or a mission together.
A lot of my colleagues are of the Christian faith, and I think that's awesome. I'm personally of the Jewish faith, and I think there are a lot of shared values. I was born in Ukraine just before the fall of the Soviet Union to a Jewish father and a Russian mother. And we left Ukraine, which was our home, because one, we saw better economic opportunities elsewhere after the fall of the Soviet Union, and two, because there was still anti-Semitism in Ukraine and we didn't feel safe being there. So what I have here now in my life in the US, thanks to my parents and my grandparents, is a life of, boundless opportunity. And that's what I want to try to give to people through my career and also through my giving and volunteering, opportunities to be successful, to have a fulfilling life that sustains financially and spiritually, and also a place where people feel like they belong.
Eventide's approach to values-based investing is grounded in the belief that humankind was created with intrinsic dignity, value, and worth. Business 360 is the process by which we look to and embrace companies that we believe God would say, yes, you should profit from that because it is producing what we call human flourishing. So we take a holistic approach that I think is also unique, that's really just rooted in this expression of desiring to perpetuate what God says is good.
We in the West, we have such privilege. We have no idea how privileged we are. And with all of the privilege comes great responsibility. And my contention is that given how much capital we have, there's no society even remotely close to where we are in the United States today. And so how is it that we don't view that as a privilege, as an opportunity to take that wealth, the talents that God has given us, and deploy that to serve others in ways that are in keeping with our fundamental mandate to love our neighbor?
John Wesley preached, make all you can to give all you can, but make all you can without hurting yourself or your neighbor in body or in soul. We often only say make all you can to give all you can. But the other side of that equation is how you make your money, how you go about conducting business. What are the types of businesses we even start? Even going back to the book of Genesis, when God creates, He calls good over and over the thing that He creates. So if He created us in His image, and if work is given to us even before the fall happened, question is, what types of work, what types of businesses, and what type of investing should we be engaging in?
We're really coming up against an industry of finance that has been trained to think about things according to the story of the world. And I think we've spent much less time reflecting on God's story for work, for business, for investing, and really saying, how can we bring this story into our lives? How can we become a part of God's story? How can we live that out? Only then, I think, are we going to see a significant movement in the church. Only then are we going to see people being very excited about investment opportunities like Eventide or others.
When you look at the total capital that Christians have at their disposal and how much of that is deployed in manners that are sensitive to faith issues, I mean, we are looking at certainly less than 1%, but it is a tiny, tiny percentage right now. But the time is now, and those who join us now in this endeavor, I think will experience the joys of what it's like to start a movement from the very beginning. And so it depends on that interplay of the common good and the redemptive good. And I think that all the things that we're doing here are hopefully in service of this goal of getting the church to a place of health holistically across all different dimensions, not just personal dealings with sin, but financially dealing with our vocational capital, getting the church in a healthy place so that we can begin to do what God has called us to do with delivering the Great Commission to the ends of the earth. So that's my big dream, and I hope to play at least a small part in that dream.
Here's another important point for us to remember. No matter how developed the marketplace is, we cannot journey alone. We need allies. That might start with consulting an advisor who is knowledgeable in faith-driven investing. We have a list of advisors and fund providers available as a resource on our website. The Kingdom Advisor website is another wonderful resource. We also encourage you to continue going deeper in this community. Perhaps God has given you a unique calling to invest in specific regions, or maybe God has given you a passion for certain causes or industries, and He's given you the knowledge to align with them. We encourage you to connect with like-minded investors. Later on in this series, you'll hear about Faith-Driven Investor Plus. This is an ongoing community of people who have gone through this foundation course and want to proactively look for ways to use our investments to impact the world for God's glory. Now spend some time in your group talking about this session and how it relates to the journey that you're on. Opening ourselves up to learning from one another. Be honest with each other. What you get out of this time together will only be as enriching and life-giving as what you put into it. See you at the next session.